The Mosaic of Sobriety. To Tex and Max and Don and Frankie and Jack and Jim and Bill and Norm and all the rest who have taught me patiently throughout the years. Empathic understanding. It is reported that someone once asked the great Louis Armstrong, "What's jazz?" After a moment of thought, he replied, "Man, if you've got to ask, you ain't never gonna know." I feel almost the same way in trying to describe the characteristic which enables someone to get close to alcoholics and share their feelings in such a way that one can offer recovery to the sufferer. Empathy can be defined as the ability to experience the feelings of others. But what I am talking about goes much further. It includes the ability to let the other person know you are experiencing those feelings and the toughness that allows you to survive and function even during sharing of feelings. Some use the phrase tough love to describe how one must feel if one would help the alcoholic. It's not a bad effort. One must love the alcoholic and still be tough enough not to be manipulated, angered, and disappointed by someone who has made a career of such activity. One of the commonest pitfalls for those who would help the alcoholic is to confuse sympathy with empathy. I may be skating on thin semantic ice, but I see the person who feels sympathy for the alcoholic as not only experiencing their feelings, but being affected by them. The result, of course, is no help to the alcoholic, a counselor who either drifts into another business or who gets all mired down in emotional problems related to the alcoholic. It's no wonder there is a shortage of effective alcoholism counselors. One must love alcoholics enough to cry with them and be tough enough to survive when the alcoholics don't survive. I can't define empathic understanding, but I know it when I see it. So do the alcoholics. Uncertainty. If I were forced to choose the most difficult part of the atmosphere surrounding the alcoholic family, I believe I would choose uncertainty. This uncertainty takes many forms, and all the forms are hard to deal with. First, of course, is the uncertainty about whether the person is really an alcoholic. Since much of the alcoholic's energy is devoted to promoting this ambiance, it is not surprising that it is some time before this uncertainty is resolved. Next is the uncertainty of the alcoholic's behavior. One day they will return home exactly when they say they will, and the next, they won't get home until morning. Sometimes they are exemplary persons, and the next, they are not fit to live with. Sometimes they seem to be supremely self-confident, and the next moment, they are uncertain and withdrawn. A pervasive uncertainty is that of the future. Will the alcoholic be able to hold their job? Will the paycheck come home, or will it stay with the operator of a gin mill? Will there be a continuing home for the children, or will the marriage come apart? One could go on, but the effort of this uncertainty is catastrophic. If the alcoholics were always unpleasant and rotten, it would be easy to deal with them. The boss would fire them, the spouse would divorce them, and the children would learn to call someone else mommy or daddy. But the alcoholics have periods of delightful behavior. Their work is excellent. They remember birthdays and anniversaries. They mow the lawn and bake cookies. Then, when everyone is beginning to relax, they blow the lid off and everything is in an uproar. Sometimes one feels like telling the alcoholics to drink all the time, so everyone can see how rotten they are and take appropriate action. If the uncertainty is there, no one knows just what to do. When they are certain, the course of action is easy to follow. Alcoholism is a primary illness. This is probably a term someplace that describes an idea that appears to be true, that will stand all the tests of logic that we apply to it, that fits our needs very nicely, and that still is not true. The idea that alcoholism is a primary illness may be one such idea. For those of us who are faced with the everyday need of dealing with alcoholism, however, the primary illness concept will do very nicely until someone comes along with a better one. While we're waiting for that better idea, treating alcoholism as a primary illness serves us very well. One of the basic lessons I have learned from alcoholics is to keep it simple. What can be simpler than the concept that alcoholism is a primary illness? Now we don't have to listen to endless stories about how badly the alcoholics were used in their childhood. Now we don't have to listen to a lot of nonsense about their spouses driving them to drink. Now we don't have to dig endlessly into the past to discover the turning point of the alcoholic's drinking. All we have to say is, "You've got it. What are you going to do about it?" I suspect that the very simplicity of this idea is what turns most professionals off. If there is no mystique about treating alcoholics that is not in the sole possession of the priesthood, then why have a priesthood at all? One might go a step further and into the field of prevention. I know no illness except alcoholism that one can make a 100% copper-bound riveted guarantee it will not occur if a person does certain things. One can get lung cancer if one doesn't smoke or get polio from a polio shot, but one will never get alcoholism if one doesn't drink. It is probably too simple a concept for us, but it's worth thinking about. Early identification. Early identification is a nice round phrase that one often hears in the alcoholism business, but it doesn't mean very much. We know that alcoholism, like any other disease, is most successfully treated early, but no one seems to know what early is. I suppose we could call identification early if the alcoholics have not exhausted all their family, physical, and social resources. It is earlier than the chronic revolving door alcoholic, since alcoholics at this stage are sick. We can move back a bit and say that when alcoholics' drinking begins to interfere with their job, early identification is possible. But this is still a long way from early identification. Most relationships deteriorate long before jobs are threatened, and one of the most effective defenses of alcoholics is to refer to their jobs. I have never lost a job because of drinking. I have never missed a day's work because of drinking. I am a vice president or toolmaker or airline pilot or locomotive engineer, and no alcoholic could handle the responsibility that I must handle. So we must look for even earlier identification. The spouse is the second person to know the disease, the first, of course, being the alcoholic. So when the spouse knows, do we have early identification? I think not. The onset of the illness is so subtle, and the spouse is so involved in the disease at every level that when the spouse finally says, I think I'm married to an alcoholic, you can be sure there is a sick family living at that house. So let's go back to the very first person who knows there is something wrong, the alcoholic. This is an earlier identification, but I'm not sure it is early. This is the point where alcoholics try to change their drinking so it will not cause problems, or they do their level best to hide these problems from everyone around them. They are often successful in creating an atmosphere in which their difficulties are unnoticed or at least misidentified, and the disease can progress along its later stages. When then is early identification? I think I know, but it is not likely to do you or me any good currently. The earliest clue I know of for alcoholism is when the drinker discovers that alcohol works better for them than it does for other people. It may be at the time of their first drink. Someone has a pint and passes it around. Everyone, including alcoholics, talk about how rotten it tastes, how it burns going down, and wonders how anyone can ever like the stuff. It is so bad they decide to leave the bottle lying in the park. One person, however, decides to slip back and have another nip to see if it really tasted that bad. That person is an alcoholic. The drink does something special for them and will continue to do so again and again. That is our alcoholic. That is early identification, and that is our problem. Alcohol is so special to the alcoholic that there is no questioning their drinking for a long, long time. By then, early identification is a thing of the long past. The process of recovery. We don't know very much about what happens when an alcoholic recovers, and as a matter of fact, we don't really know when the recovery begins. A superficial observation might lead to the conclusion that recovery begins when alcoholics finally surrender and admit that indeed they are alcoholics and that they need help. But when you talk to many alcoholics, you discover that they thought they had made that surrender many, many times before it finally became real. They can differentiate between the effect of this surrender, but they can't really differentiate between the feeling of the false surrenders and the real thing. I submit that the recovery process may start long before we think it does. It may begin when alcoholics first regret something they have said or done while drinking. It may continue during the long and painful process, which can be called self-cures. It goes on during the geographical cures, the beer-only cures, the never-before-five cures, the weekend-only cures, and the special occasion cures. It goes on during the hospitalizations, the arrests, the divorces, and the lost jobs. It continues during the false starts, the slips and relapses, and the striving to go back to the good drinking. When finally the insanity ends, it is only a step in the recovery because we know that the recovery must last for the rest of the alcoholic's life. The recovery is a long, wasteful, traumatic, and entirely unacceptable process. Very often they die during the recovery process, and the cost of both individuals and society is too high. We must seek together some way of shortening the process because we cannot afford to pay the price any longer. Drunkalogs. I went to a few AA meetings, but all I heard was a series of drunkalogs. I see no way that listening to that kind of crap is going to solve my drinking problems. Well, we have run into this brand of resistance from alcoholics who are flirting with recovery but are not ready to stop drinking. We tell the alcoholic to go to another group that does not specialize in drunkalogs. I think that drunkalogs serve an important function in the recovery of alcoholics. They are sort of a way station between drinking and sobriety. The alcoholics who are just beginning their recovery have often achieved considerable stature among their drinking peers for their drinking behavior. The quantity they drink, the trouble they get into, the number of jobs they have lost, the number of times their spouses have left them, all these things are observed and admired by their drinking companion. Now they stop drinking and go to an AA meeting and discover that they are among kindred souls, even though those souls are not drinking. They seek to gain status and recognition by putting on a drunkalog that will top all others. We can sense that they are maturing in their recovery when the recitals of their drinking escapades gradually lessen and they spend more time talking about their recovery. They realize they are accepted and loved by this bunch of recovering drunks, and they don't really have to impress them with what a bad egg they have been. While we probably wouldn't call it a drunkalog, the recital by recovering alcoholics of some of their problems occurring while sober probably has a real place in the program. This is a part of the vehicle of self-revelation by which the alcoholics with a mature recovery relate to the newcomer. It is one of the most valuable techniques that alcoholics use to help each other. If you listen closely, however, you'll hear recovering alcoholics spend a good deal more time on the good things that have happened to them sober than on the bad things that happen to them drunk. To think about oneself. Telling alcoholics to think about themselves sounds about as wise as telling a fish to get wet. After observing the self-centered, self-oriented, self-serving behavior of alcoholics for years and years, anyone close to alcoholics will think you are really confused when you start telling alcoholics to think about themselves. They haven't thought about anything else for, these many years. If you observe closely, however, you will realize that all this activity doesn't really involve thinking about oneself. A lot of time is given to obtaining, drinking, and thinking about booze. Another large measure of thought is wrapped up in dealing with the effects of drinking. More and more thought and time is spent directing others' attention to the spouse or someone else who can be blamed for the drinking. More time is devoted to explaining away poor work performance or convincing the police that they really thought they ran over a beer can when they really ran into the mayor's parked Cadillac. It is possible to go on, but When we think about it, we realize that no matter what the alcoholics are thinking about, it is not themselves. The whole effort of alcoholics is directed outward. They are working day and night to control the ambiance in which they find themselves. They need to regulate the whole environment in which they live to make continued drinking possible, and as their drinking gets worse, they spend more and more time regulating their surroundings. They really don't have time to think about themselves. They're just too busy. When we look at it from this perspective, it is easy to see why it becomes necessary to get alcoholics to abandon the whole feverish business of regulating their environment and turn their thoughts inward. They must have time to think about themselves and a clear head to do it. Only then can they take the first faltering steps towards recovery. Humility and self-esteem. One of the greatest things about me is my humility. Well, this bit of alcoholic self-evaluation contains the dilemma faced by most everyone in the business of trying to understand the alcoholic. We're constantly aware of the utter lack of self-esteem of the practicing alcoholic, and yet we find this condition almost completely hidden behind a facade of arrogance, conceit, and apparently self-serving behavior. It is a curious fact of the human condition that persons who come on as superior and overbearing are really cowering behind these defenses with the knowledge that they, of all people, are most vulnerable. There is a temptation to strip away those defenses so that alcoholics can see what they really are and to feel a great deal of personal satisfaction that we have the skill to perceive their duplicity and expose it. The result is, of course, to so frighten the alcoholics that they take refuge in the only defense that they know of that will repel all assaults, the bottle. So, we are faced with the necessity for eliminating the alcoholic's primary line of defense, which is alcohol, and then gradually taking away all the secondary defenses they have built, which make them seem arrogant and overbearing. At the same time, we must substitute in their place the calm, strong sureness of self-esteem. Obviously, the change must be gradual, and new defenses must be substituted as the old ones are removed, else panic ensues. How to proceed? Look at the 12 steps of AA. First, surrender while at the same time there is a reliance on a higher power to defend the alcoholic from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. After this comes to a method of dealing with the past, followed by a new life. It works. The dividing line. We used to hear a great deal about the dividing line which a drinker crossed when he or she went from social drinking to alcoholism. No one could tell where this line was when the alcoholic crossed it, or why some drinkers crossed it and others did not. I have reached the conclusion that no such line exists, but that the alcoholic is an alcoholic from or prior to their first drink. But there is another dividing line which is real and which cries out for our attention. It is the dividing line that separates the employed, socially accepted long-term alcoholic from the chronic police offender. Everyone who works for an employee assistance program has had an opportunity to observe this dividing line in action. This line many employed alcoholics do not cross. I have seen many employed alcoholics who are most certainly suffering from the result of prolonged alcoholism. They have fat livers, purple noses, gastritis, pancreatitis, and all the physical consequences of alcoholism. If one were to dress them in cast-off clothes and let them go 3 days without shaving or showering, they would be indistinguishable from the classic Skid Row bum. These advanced alcoholics are employed in almost every kind of job. I guess you would have to call them late-stage alcoholics in disguise. The question we must ask ourselves is why some alcoholics cross this line and why some do not. The difference seems to lie in the skill and determination of the family, and especially the employer, in covering up for the alcoholic. If the employer tolerates the alcohol-impaired job performance of an advanced alcoholic, then usually the family will stick around. If there is some money coming in, there is a possibility of maintaining some vestige of family life. It is only when the employee loses their job that the rest of the fabric of their lives starts coming unraveled. So, alcoholics are allowed to continue drinking by the elaborate cover-up we provide until they die from the booze through suicide, by accident, or from any of the physical ailments to which advanced alcoholics are heirs. Sometimes the cover-up is by the employer, by the union, by the law partners, by the college faculty, by other co-workers, but we protect the alcoholic to death. It is an eerie feeling to be talking to someone who enjoys a considerable status in our world, and to suddenly slip into the feeling that this is an alcoholic who could be labeled Skid Row, which is all dressed up and playing the part of a sober, productive citizen. It is not really the skill of the alcoholic which allows them to play this role so well. It is the elaborate facade that society has constructed and behind which we allow them to drink themselves to death. Except for the cover-up efforts of society, there would be many more than 5% of our alcoholics on Skid Row. They go directly to the cemetery from the executive suite, rather than stopping off at Skid Row first. Loss of control. Many of us who try to understand alcoholics feel that the one common identifiable characteristic of alcoholics is that once they have taken a drink, they cannot predict how much more they will drink. As a sort of corollary, they often are unable to decide when and where they are going to drink, and this lack of control often leads to drinking at inappropriate times and places. Let's go another step and examine loss of control under a brighter light. A drug is often defined as a substance that, when administered to an organism, will in some way alter the state of that organism. I think we can accept that, and we accept the definition of alcohol as a drug. Now, let's just think for a minute. Once a drug is ingested, injected, absorbed, or in some other manner administered to our bodies, we no longer have any control. What happens then may be regulated by bodily states, the quantity and nature of the drug, the method of administration, the expectation of the user, and by many other factors, but it is beyond the conscious control of the recipient. We have lost control. We have control over the drug when it is outside our bodies, but we have really lost control once it is in our system. One might say, I have both an ulcer and a headache. I'm going to take some aspirin, and by exercising control, I will cause it to cure my headache without letting it affect my ulcer. Once that aspirin is in my body, many factors will decide what it will do, but none of them is in my conscious control. So it is with alcohol. The alcoholic's behavior reflects in extreme degree what happens to anyone who uses alcohol. Once alcohol is ingested, we can no longer control its effects. And since alcohol is the drug most likely to affect critical judgment, the subsequent behavior of the user is no longer completely under his or her control. When one has a serious loss of control, we call them an alcoholic. When one has a less serious loss of control, we call them a social drinker. A matter of choice. Probably one of the most important ways in which human beings differ from other animals is that they have a choice. A dog is a dog and must always act like a dog. A robin must always build a robin's nest and not an eagle's nest or a wren's nest. A cat has no choice but to do the same thing that all other cats do. The human being has a choice. 1,000 times a day, we exercise the privilege of choice. We choose to act this way instead of that for a multitude of reasons, but always we have a choice. The very fact that we can make a choice then means that sometimes we are going to make the wrong choice. If we always made the right choice, we wouldn't be exercising free choice at all. I think this is a most important principle in understanding alcoholics, or for alcoholics to understand themselves. Alcoholics always have the choice to drink or not, but once they take that drink, by some mechanism we don't understand, they surrender the right of choice. They may take another drink, or they may not. They may get drunk, or they may not. They may stay drunk for days, or they may not. But they are no longer able to choose. No matter whether alcoholics have been sober for 1 day or for 30 years, at any moment, They have a choice whether to drink or not. It is only when they take that drink that they lose the power to make a choice. They have made the wrong choice many, many times and have paid the price. We need to help them make the right choice so they can reap the rewards. New loves for old. I have had in my library for many years a book called The Story of Mrs. Murphy. Hardly anyone to whom I have loaned it has been impressed, and most of them couldn't understand why I thought it was such a great book. Very simply, it is the story of an alcoholic from his young manhood until his death on Skid Row. It describes in vivid detail how the illness affects the alcoholic and those around him, and shows graphically the erratic course he follows to his death. I think maybe most readers are misled by the title. There are several Mrs. Morpheas in the book, including the alcoholic's mother and his common-law wives. I don't suppose it really soaked into my head that Mrs. Murphy was until I heard someone say that in certain parts of Ireland, whiskey is referred to as Mrs. Murphy. If you add to this information the fact that we sometimes refer to the alcoholic as being wedded to the bottle, the book and its title make a lot of sense. Very early in the alcoholic's drinking career, the spouse finds that alcohol is a very real competitor. It demands more and more of the alcoholic's time and attention and is as disruptive of the marriage relationship as any other third party could be. Very often, the marriage is destroyed, so the alcoholic can devote more and more time to this demanding relationship. As the old relationships vanish, they come to rest in one focus: alcohol. All the old loves die, some quickly, some slowly. Hobbies go early because the time and money they consume are needed for the new love. Friends vanish to be replaced by persons who drink as much or preferably more than the alcoholic. These friends go too as the all-consuming passion for alcohol takes over everything. Jobs go and marriages go. There is wry humor in the fact that this new love is so demanding that one of the casualties is the marriage bed. We could probably stop right here, having gained some insight into the mind of alcoholics, but let us go on. When we arrive on the scene, we find that the new love has pretty much eliminated the competition. The alcoholics have traded most of their old loves for new ones. Then we bustle up to the alcoholics, asking them how they would like to give up this new love on which they have spent so much. The prospect scares them to death because without alcohol, they would have no loves at all. No sexual love because that vanished years ago. No love of friends because the friends have been replaced and their replacements have disappeared. No agape love because they cannot believe that God loves them, nor can they love God because of their total commitment to alcohol. It is not enough to preside over a divorce from this new love. We must see that a veritable smorgasbord of love is laid out before the alcoholic. They may choose what they need, but we must make it possible for them to achieve new relationships and find new loves. I went to a goodly number of AA meetings before I discovered what was going on was a process of exchanging new loves for old and, most all, exchanging the love of alcohol for that of a higher power, which I call God. I'm glad I'm an alcoholic. I've heard this statement many times from recovering alcoholics, and strangest of all, they mean it. Often they mean different things, but the impressive part is that they really mean it. The first time I heard it was from an alcoholic who achieved his sobriety so long ago that the only place that would take him for treatment was a mental hospital. His treatment was rudimentary at best, but he had been sober for many years. He had a work assignment in the kitchen of the hospital as part of his therapy, and every morning on his way across the grounds, he could hear the cries of the mental patients in those pre-tranquilizer days. The thought came to him and stayed, that he was very lucky he was an alcoholic because he had an illness he could do something about, while those on the third floor and the backward would be there forever, helpless to control their fate. He had a disease he could do something about, and that thought was the key to his sobriety. He knew he was lucky to be an alcoholic. There is another point of view represented by the alcoholics who say they are lucky to be alcoholic, and it is just as valid as the ones who feel that alcoholism is better than, say, cancer or lateral sclerosis. These are the alcoholics who have been forced by their illness to come to know themselves, to deal with their character defects, and to learn to know a higher power on the most practical, intimate terms. When you hear them talk, you know that they have paid a dreadful price for this new way of life, but that they are living a far richer, deeper, and more fulfilling life than they ever would have led if they had not been alcoholic. There is a third group of alcoholics who talk about how lucky one is to be an alcoholic, but their position is more subtle than the others. Those are the people who say, you know something? If someone invented a pill today that would guarantee that I would go back to drinking in a socially acceptable manner, I wouldn't take it. Believe them. These are people who have come to terms with life. The experience of being alcoholic has forced them to go through the painful, often traumatic adjustments which are necessary to live without any kind of chemical helper, and they like what they have achieved. They, too, feel lucky to be alcoholic. When alcoholics say, I am glad I'm an alcoholic, I believe them. Symbiosis. The use of a word like this is scarcely in keeping with my usual vocabulary, but there is no other word that expresses exactly what I mean. Symbiosis is defined as a relationship between two organisms that is beneficial to or necessary to both. It is more than parasiticism that may damage the host and is usually unnecessary to the host. The people or circumstances in the field of alcoholism that we call enablers come close to symbiosis, but I am talking about a much more sophisticated and elaborate relationship than that. It is often profitable to study an extreme case when trying to understand a pathological condition, and this is what I think we should do here. Very often, as we go about the business of seeking out and caring for alcoholics, we discover two people living in a situation that can be described only as symbiosis. The most common form which I have seen is a middle-aged man living with a very aged mother. Usually her husband is dead and she has a minuscule income from some source or another. They live in a decaying home and they seem to survive only because of their relationship with each other. The mother furnishes the home and, from her very slender resources, the food and utilities. The alcoholic draws on his ingenuity to find the money for drinking, and usually that is all he spends his money on. Very often his relationship is in an unbroken continuum from the usual child-parent relationship and never matures into anything else. I once watched a mother bring a 50-year-old a glass of warm milk, lay out his jammies, and then literally tuck him into bed at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sometimes the relationship is interrupted by the man's marriage, but usually the marriage flounders and he returns to the nest. I have known this relationship to exist between father and son more rarely. I have never observed a mother-daughter or a father-daughter relationship of this kind. Maybe they exist, but I've never seen them. To the casual observer, it seems that the benefits are all one way. The alcoholics have a warm place to sleep and as many meals as they can use, which usually aren't many. They contribute to the finances, nothing at all, and usually won't even mow the lawn or shovel the walk. If this is true symbiosis, then both parties must profit. It seems that the elder person profits simply by having a reason to stay alive. We watch them getting older and older and marvel at all the ways they continue to function. They live on practically nothing, go nowhere, and devote all their waning strength to the alcoholic. The true test of a symbiotic relationship is that if one or the other party dies, the partner also dies. We observe this regularly. No matter which one goes first, the other doesn't last long. It just seems that some vital element in their life is missing. With the insight given by this look at this state of symbiosis, it is not so difficult anymore to understand the relationship between the enabler and the alcoholic. They need each other. When society is the enabler, we must draw the same conclusion. We know that alcoholism is not a simple disease. and this little venture into the unknown should verify that fact. We need a discipline that spends far more time studying the disease and far less time protecting society's right to drink if we are ever going to get to the bottom of the matter. The professionals see them first. We talk about the early identification of alcoholics about as much as we do about the weather, and we do about the same thing about it, nothing. We seem to operate under the delusion that alcoholics are completely hidden in our society until someone suddenly points a finger and says, "You know something? That's an alcoholic." This we like to call identification, but it certainly isn't early. Let's look at it a little more closely. First, of course, the alcoholic knows something is wrong long before anyone else puts a finger on it. We know about when alcoholics will identify themselves to others, and it surely is not on stage. The family next knows about the alcoholism, but they join the conspiracy of cover-up simply because they don't know what else to do. The same thing usually happens with the employer. In the face of all this covering up, how in heaven's name will we ever learn to identify the alcoholics at an earlier stage? Well, it could be simple. By the time the alcoholics have been seen by the counselor, they have been seen by all manners of professionals. They have likely seen the doctor for alcohol-related ailments. They have often seen attorneys for legal problems and financial problems. They have many times seen a clergy person for marital and family problems. They may have been arrested by the police for drunk driving or domestic violence. It would be very inaccurate to designate such persons as hidden alcoholics. What happens when alcoholics are seen by these professionals? Unfortunately, most of the professionals see them within the narrow context of their own profession, deal with that problem, and pass them on. I once read a study that found that most doctors referred alcoholics to clergy persons, and most clergy persons referred alcoholics to doctors. It would seem logical, then, that we could teach the professionals to identify alcoholics while they are dealing with the problems presented by the alcoholics and make every effort to refer them to alcoholism professionals. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked that way much of the time. We meet with the Ministerial Association or the Bar Association or the Medical Association, but little comes of it. Some of the endless money we spend on alcoholism could be used to find out why professionals don't refer alcoholics to alcoholism professionals and what we might do to change that situation. Shrinking jobs. I have heard that originality is usually undetected plagiarism. In this case, the plagiarism is so flagrant that I must reveal the source. The ideal was originally suggested to me by Dr. Paul Sherman, and I informed him that I was going to use it. It is commonplace to talk about identifying alcoholics by observing decreasing job performance. It is equally commonplace to admit that professionals or executives who are alcoholic are seldom brought to task through the observation of decreasing job performance. We usually attribute this phenomenon to a specialized form of the great cover-up that society engages in to prevent alcoholics from getting help until it is too late. The only difference seems to be that those who are engaged in protecting executive or professional performance by alcoholics until it is too late are more skilled and have better opportunities for doing so. This is probably true to some degree, but the real fact of the matter is that we don't catch executive alcoholics because they probably do their job just as well as they have always done. They just don't do as much of it. The first matters to go are usually the innovative, imaginative, progressive parts of their jobs that are the reason they are drawing a high salary in the first place. They establish routines for getting the job done with little input from them, and they can then spend more time and energy on drinking. Many of the people they work with, their peers and their subordinates, take over parts of their jobs to protect themselves out of loyalty to the company and because they think they are really helping the alcoholics. There is usually someone lurking in the wings who would like to have the executive's job and are always glad to take over any part that is undone. Then, when the day of reckoning comes, they can point out that since they were really doing much of the job anyway, they might just as well have the title and salary too. I won't belabor the looseness of an organization with room for several executives who are doing steadily shrinking jobs, but there are many. It seems that nobody can be very busy if such shenanigans can go on, yet the conditions exist throughout business and industry. Maybe we should stop watching job performance so closely and spend more time measuring job shrinkage. We would probably find a lot of alcoholics we have been missing. Doing the right things for the wrong reason. It would seem to me that I have spent much of my time in this field changing my mind. In the good old days when I had answers for most questions, it seemed to me that there was little point in alcoholics going to treatment or to AA if they did not have a real commitment to sobriety. This reflected the common belief that alcoholics had to hit bottom before they could be helped. Waiting for this event to occur seemed like just a waste of time, money, and lives that we came up with a new concept called raising the bottom. We felt that if we could raise the consciousness of alcoholics to where they became aware of what a mess they were in, the mess might not have to get worse before they sought help. It was out of this idea that the concept calls creating a crisis arose. We were often able to get alcoholics into a treatment program before they became basket cases, and in truth, we did raise the bottom. The next logical step was to raise the bottom even further. As we looked at alcoholics' lives, we realized that we didn't have to create a crisis because they were already living in a welter of crisis. We discovered that what we needed to do was penetrate the network of enablers who surrounded alcoholics and get them to stop their work. In the industrial setting, we found that the very person who should be motivating the alcoholics to recovery was the key person in enabling them to continue drinking. When we stripped away the cordon of protectors that surrounded the alcoholic, they were sometimes so frightened by the cold world of reality that they sought help, and sometimes they were so frightened that they took even greater refuge in the bottle. A common technique used by alcoholics is to go to treatment or counseling or AA or whatever, just to get the heat off. And then when those around them have relaxed a bit, they can return to drinking and their endless search to drink happily rather than tragically. I am not so sure this is bad. I would rather have alcoholics in the hospital or in the hands of a good counselor than in a gin mill. Who can say what the real reasons are? They may say to themselves that they are laying the ultimate con on their detractors by going to treatment, but inside somewhere, they may really be seeking help. I would much rather have alcoholics come to one of our industrial counselors for help with their drinking than for help in getting their job back, but I would rather have them come for any reason than not come at all. I guess it's like when I was a restless kid and told my father that there was no point in me going to church on Sunday. I wasn't getting a thing out of it. Well, he replied, at least you'll be exposed to it. A 50-50 chance. Alcoholics have a 50-50 chance to get well. Either they do or they don't. The first time I heard this little beauty, I was hard-pressed to find the wisdom in it. But the wisdom is there. There is little danger in oversimplifying the recovery of the alcoholic with all the professionals and experts striving to make it more complex so we can proceed. We often deal with the alcoholic's decision-making process as if it were a one-time thing, and as if once the decision to drink no more is made, there are no more decisions necessary. The Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous knows better and asks alcoholics to make a series of decisions not to drink, one each hour for the next 24 hours. This seems to cut the decision-making into manageable chunks. I have known alcoholics who, at the beginning of their sobriety, made decisions not to drink for as little as a half hour at a time. Now we can see the decision-making of alcoholics as a whole series of very simple decisions, to drink or not to drink. Once they take a drink, they can no longer make the decision and no longer have a 50-50 chance to make the right decision. Recovered or recovering? There are two schools of thought among members of AA as to which word best describes their status, recovered or recovering. With the almost infinite possibilities of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, there is room for both, and I think that it is profitable and enlightening to examine the difference of opinion. The alcoholics who say they have recovered have, indeed, they have recovered from the insanity of drinking. They have recovered from the endless routine of getting something to drink, getting drunk, getting over the drink, suffering all the remorse and guilt and anger that follows the drunk, and then looking around for the means of doing it again. The alcoholics who say they are recovering certainly are. They are engaged in a lifelong program of changing themselves in such a manner that they do not drink nor have any reason to drink. So they are right too. Alcoholism is a strange and wonderful phenomenon, and here is an example of its uniqueness. People must first recover from this disease before they can begin recovering. Alcoholism seems to resist every effort to categorize it. While disease is a far better name than we used to call it, it doesn't resemble any other disease known. I'll let the scientists and researchers untangle this one. We know how to help alcoholics, whether they are recovered or recovering. The honeymooners. We are familiar with the spectacle of old-timers, recovering alcoholics, hoary with age and with wisdom, sitting back with their cups of coffee and observing the newly won alcoholics who are so happy they can hardly stand it. "Go ahead and enjoy yourself, kid," they say. "When the honeymoon is over, you'll discover that sobriety isn't as hot as you think it is." It often becomes all too obvious that they are right. The first rosy glow of sobriety is replaced by the grim dawn of reality, and the alcoholics are often disillusioned. For many years, people have told them that drinking is their problem. They have solved that problem in the approved manner, but they still have about the same number of problems as before. Sometimes it seems they have even more because now they are facing the problems and dealing with them. In the past, they used alcohol as a means of escaping their problems. What they have done is traded their drinking problems for problems of sobriety or everyday life. The truth of the matter is best illustrated by a comparison with a honeymoon. It is inevitable that the honeymoon of a married couple is followed by disillusionment and disappointment. The honeymoon, the moonlight and roses are followed by bills and babies. But that doesn't mean the marriage is a failure. It seems simply that the couple must grow up and realize that they are living in the real world and that they must work at being married. I suppose those of us who hold out the state of sobriety as a condition of never-ending bliss is just as much at fault as those who do the same thing with marriage. Honeymoons are great, and every alcoholic and every married person should have one. But neither the marriage nor the sobriety needs to be over when the honeymoon is over. The ending of the honeymoon just signifies that it's time to grow up and get to work. Became willing. Asking the alcoholic to stop drinking is just too much. When you do this, you ensure that most alcoholics will fail to recover. What we need to aim for is improved drinking, not abstinence. The prophets of this doctrine are abroad in the land and, in fact, have been in positions of power for a long time. Much of the effort of our nation to help alcoholics has been dictated by this concept. Once more, we go to those who have recovered from the disease for guidance, and the journey takes us again to Alcoholics Anonymous. AA points to the 12 steps, which, if you haven't read by now, you should read at once. The first glimmer of understanding begins when we read that they are suggested steps, not mandated, but suggested. Let's read through the steps together. Words like sought and become willing and became willing give some clues. Tried is another. We're ready opens another door. A careful reading of the 12 steps and an understanding of the program show that it is not tough at all. It does not demand that the alcoholic leap tall buildings with a single bound or run faster than a speeding bullet. All the program asks is that the alcoholic truly desires to quit drinking. Is there any alcoholic who at some time or another has not truly desired to quit drinking? It is not a permanent condition, but it doesn't require any impossible feats of will or efforts beyond human ability. The recovering alcoholics who know they are just ordinary human beings. They don't have any special reserves of strength to draw on that are not available to all alcoholics or to all human beings for that matter. The world is full of alcoholics who have tried to improve their drinking. Some are in jail, some in the hospital, some are still in the joints working on improving their drinking. Some are in mental hospitals, and many are in the cemetery. I don't suppose they attend many seminars or read many scientific papers, so I doubt if the doctrine of improved drinking has any effect on them. It does influence the way taxpayers' money is spent, however, so we will all have an interest. A happy, productive, gracious life is possible without alcohol. Let's get on with it. Selective memory. One of the real problems the alcoholic has in obtaining long-term sobriety is the selective nature of the human memory. We remember the pleasure, we forget the pain. Think about it for a while. There have been times in everyone's life when their pain has been overwhelming, either physical or psychic pain or both. Now think about the pain. Does it hurt to think about it? It appears that we do not re-experience pain when we think about it. Now think about some pleasurable part of your past, something that was pleasant or enjoyable. If you're like most of us, you will get genuine pleasure out of remembering. When alcoholics first get sober, their memory of pain is overwhelming. All the guilt and anger, the sorrow and regret, all the resentment and self-loathing make it impossible for alcoholics to remember that they ever enjoyed a moment of drinking. Time passes. Gradually, the pain recedes until the alcoholic can laugh at the dreadful state in which they lived. It no longer hurts to think about it, but they can remember the good times, the warm, friendly fellowship that surrounded drinking, the glow that took the edge off all their problems, the whole drinking culture that was so supportive and at the same time permissive. These they remember with pleasure. With the memory of the drinking pain no longer hurting and the memory of the drinking pleasure giving them real joy, it's very difficult for alcoholics not to go back to the pleasure of drinking, this time by a masterful exercise of cunning. They will not go back to the pain of drinking. Maybe it wasn't so bad after all. Or was it? Don't take away their despair. I can recall one time when some of us were rushing about to help an alcoholic who was in the hospital. We were concerned with their family, their job, and we wanted to reassure them that it was perfectly all right, that they had to have a slip. We expected relapses, very professional. I don't have any idea who the recovering alcoholic was who, after observing our efforts for a while, remarked, "Don't take away their despair. They've earned it." This is an unarguable wisdom. Think of the price that the alcoholic had to pay for that despair. They have spent a fortune on booze. They have lost huge amounts of wages. They have lost their self-respect, suffered the pangs of remorse and sorrow, damaged their family and damaged their health. And we were busy taking away the thing they had bought. Alcoholics have paid a huge price for their despair. It is utterly precious to them. It is the coin in which they can pay for their recovery. As we observe alcoholics, we can't help being impressed by the tremendous price they are paying for their drinking. When they have paid the price and accumulated their despair, let's let them keep it. When they are ready to exchange their despair for recovery, let's be sure they get their money's worth. Prevention. The word of the hour is prevention. If we could only prevent people from becoming ill with the disease, which we call alcoholism, our troubles would be over. True, there would be a lot of unemployment among us who make our living in discovery, treatment, and research of alcoholism, but it is likely that we could find another problem that would require our attention. If people in the alcoholism field are nothing else, they are adaptable. Do no harm. It is likely that most of the ailments which beset humankind would heal themselves if we would just let them alone. Witness the fact that humankind survived for no one knows how many years before the word doctor was ever coined. Witness the fact that humankind also survived the first years of doctoring when the sovereign remedy for many illnesses was bleeding. The point at which this reasoning fails is that while benign neglect has preserved the species and might do so in the future, it doesn't offer much hope to any individual within the species. When you happen to be the individual, doing nothing doesn't have much appeal. Our intense interest in preserving ourselves seems to cry out that we must do something when we perceive that something is wrong. Our humanitarian concern, the concern for other individuals, by extension, seems to require that we do something for them. So we hustle about, trying this remedy and that, and we sometimes find that the individual recovers. We attribute this recovery to our efforts, and with this added knowledge, hasten to do something for the next person. What we neglect to observe is that there are also those who recover for whom we do nothing. We do so much for those we do not help, and so little for those we do help, that one must ask if our intervention had any effect at all. It would seem to me that the first concern of anyone in the helping professions is that we first make sure that our intervention won't make things worse. I suppose a doctor could cure a hangnail by amputation of a leg, but the hangnail would probably go away by itself. We most assuredly aren't dealing with hangnails, so we seem to do a lot of heroic surgery. Maybe we should make sure first that the sufferer won't get well without us. Self-revelation. One of the most powerful tools that recovering alcoholics must help other alcoholics is self-revelation. They make their initial contact with the still suffering alcoholics and then proceed to tell them how it was with them while they were still drinking. They describe the broken promises, the good resolutions, the drinking disasters, and the sorrow and remorse which follow. They go on to tell how they came to sanity through the intervention of a caring person and through the living principles of AA. They describe how their lives are now. Unless they go through the first part, the alcoholics will not believe they understand and will not accept the second part. It seems that only when the sufferer can say, "When they are as sick as I am," can the alcoholics believe that maybe there is some hope for them too. This seems to be the basis for the now discredited theory that only one alcoholic can help another. Discredited or not, there are very few non-alcoholics who have empathy with alcoholics, which bring about a rapport that leads to recovery. The fact that there are a few of these people, however, should make us take another look at the theory. It seems to me that the self-revelation inherent in these relationships is the key, not the fact of alcoholism. As alcoholics talk about how tough it was for them, they are revealing themselves to others, just as the knight in armor used to raise his visor to show his face and extend his weapon hand empty to show that he was no threat, so we show that we mean no harm when we show our face and extend our hand. Self-revelation is not an exercise that comes easily. We spend a lot of time building defenses that are intended to do just the opposite of self-revelation. To sit down with a stranger and reveal who we are is more than most of us care to undertake. In the unique world of alcoholism, many of our cherished, carefully cultivated characteristics must be discarded. It seems that if we expect the alcoholics to trust us, we must first trust them. Recovering alcoholics have already discovered that they can trust people, and it seems easier for them to trust the suffering alcoholic. Maybe this explains why so few non-alcoholics can establish the relationship necessary to be of help. Whatever works. I once listened to a dialogue between a teacher and a student in a school on alcoholism that went something like this. Student: What particular discipline do you utilize when treating alcoholism? Teacher: Whatever works. Student: I don't think you understood my question. Are you a gestaltist, a behaviorist, or do you use psychodrama or something like that? Teacher: I use whatever works. Student: But surely you belong to some school. Do you use hypnotism, transcendental meditation, anti-abuse, acupuncture, or what? Teacher: I use whatever works. That exchange told me a great deal. To start with, it told me that the teacher knew what he was talking about and very likely was a successful alcoholism counselor. Second, it told me the student didn't know what he was talking about and likely never would. Third, it told me a great deal about the state of the art of counseling alcoholics. We are imperfect, intuitive, non-scientific, and multidimensional. We can't really put a label on what we are doing, but it seems to work. Last, it told me a great deal about those who would like to become alcoholism counselors, but just can't seem to find the handle. They want to embrace some discipline, become adept at its arcane mysteries, and then sally forth to save alcoholics from themselves. The key word is unique. Alcoholism is a unique illness, and it may be unique to each individual suffering from the illness. Surely the recovery is unique to everyone because everyone is unique. So until a better answer is presented, I feel the best answer to the question, to what discipline do successful alcoholism counselors subscribe, is whatever works. We can spoil their drinking for them. There are many times when alcoholics return after a slip with this observation: well, I got drunk, but I didn't enjoy it. Aside from the fact that such alcoholics probably haven't been enjoying drinking for a long time, they discover that something has changed. The physical effects are probably the same depending on how long they have been sober and how far the disease has progressed while they were sober. If we have done a good job, we have shown them the real drinking scene. We have shown them how transparent their excuses are, how feeble their rationalizations have become, and how shallow their rationale for drinking really is. Unwanted thoughts keep intruding into their alcohol-induced bliss. Those problems will still be there when I sober up. These drinking companions are not the kind of people I would choose if I were sober. This is really not a high-class joint, even if the upholstery is red plastic and there is carpet on the floor. I'm making an ass of myself. They come back to their sponsor or friend or counselor with the declaration, "Well, you really spoiled my drinking for me." Usually, the remark is more for real than in jest. It just isn't as much fun to drink as when their excuses were intact. Usually, the result is one of two things. They discover that it might be well to examine their life and find out if there is some way they can enjoy themselves, or they will set out to drink enough so that these troublesome thoughts do not keep intruding. Whichever route they take is another one of those things we cannot control. Insight. In some dimly remembered psychology class, I concluded that if an individual gained insight into a particular problem that he or she would work out the solution by themselves. I'm not able to question that bit of wisdom, but I have discovered a breed of alcoholics who have gained insight into their problems and kept on drinking. Now here is a challenge that makes the best of us quail. Insight can be defined as intuitive understanding, and that is exactly what these people seem to have. They know pretty much why they drink. They understand what happens when they drink. Worst of all, they grasp with considerable skill the rationale behind recovery programs. They know all about AA and how it works. They know just exactly what the counselor is up to. Add to all these persons who have gained a great deal of skill in manipulating those around them, and you've got a problem. You give it your best shot and nothing happens. It seems like there's no solution. As a matter of fact, there is a solution if the alcoholic survives. The solution lies in the very nature of the drug, which has made them sick. They cannot continue to use alcohol in the quantities they do without dulling their perceptions and losing track of some of the strands which they weave so cleverly into the fabric of their drinking lives. Despite their best efforts, they cannot keep their stratagems working. They lose track of the ball. Finally, sicker and sicker, more and more confused, lost, desperate, they surrender, and the whole elaborate structure collapses. On the ruins, they can build a new life. This kind of alcoholic requires more patience than many others. However, if we care, we'll see them out either from the morass we call alcoholism or the experience we call life. Alcoholism, spelled A-L-C-O-L-I-S-M. The title of this chapter is not a typographical error, but it may refer to a very serious error. Very frequently, when I am at a seminar or a meeting, I hear speakers talk about alcoholism. At first, I put it down to sloppy pronunciations, but now I'm not so sure. We have lived through many efforts to give a respectable name to the disease of alcoholism. One that I remember particularly was Jelinek's disease. Sometimes the euphemism was more subtle, but the effort has been pervasive. I am aware of an effort by one Australian who wanted to call alcoholism grog strife. It is not necessary to detail the efforts which have been made, but they all have one thing in common. They all represent an effort to remove the word alcohol from this disease. Do you suppose that using the word alcoholism is another effort, probably unconscious, to deny the connection between alcoholism and alcohol? Far be it for me to attribute motivation to anyone, but as Alice said, things are getting curiouser and curiouser. Your best shot. One of the things that we who would help the alcoholic are hard-pressed to figure out is why we don't give the alcoholic the same measure of tough, tender care every time. Sometimes we do so well that we believe that we had something to do with the alcoholic's recovery, and the next time we are thoroughly ashamed of the job we did. As a matter of fact, it is possible to do our best every time and still not do very well. It is a simple observation, but a very difficult one to accept that the times we don't do very well, we still may be doing our best. Anyone who has dealt with alcoholics for any length of time has been completely frustrated by the alcoholics who get one very best and still do not recover. We begin the proper blend of firmness, understanding, love, and toughness, of confrontation and caring, and still nothing happens. The corollary, of course, is alcoholics we see when we are tired, discouraged, and not very well motivated. We make a few routine gestures, and when the alcoholic leaves, we wonder in despair what we are doing in a business like this anyway, and they get sober. All we can do is give it our very best shot every time. Sometimes it isn't very good, but often it's good enough. We must remember that the recovery lies within the alcoholic and comes because of the intervention of a higher power. The best we can ask for is to become a conduit of that power. Grief. It seems to me that our society has come to distrust and avoid the emotion of grief. To me, grief is the mechanism by which we learn to deal with our losses, and the more severe the loss, the more we need to experience grief. The most severe loss we experience is the death of a loved one, and we have constructed a whole system of euphemisms to deny that death. We use passed into rest instead of died, and garden of memories instead of cemetery to deny the reality of death. Even worse, we hear the doctors prescribing tranquilizers to a bereaved person, so they will not have to deal with the realities of the death of a loved one. This is all wrong. We need to experience the emotion of grief to be healed from the pain of our losses. The more we avoid grief, the less certain and longer our healing becomes. The death of a loved one is only one of the times we experience grief. When our children grow up and don't need us anymore, we feel pain and grief. When we retire or get old or lose a job or have surgery or simply come face to face with our own mortality, we feel pain and experience grief. It seems important to me that we understand the emotion of grief if we would understand alcoholism for at least two reasons. In the first place, we discover the alcoholic using alcohol to deal with pain and avoid experiencing grief. This is the reason that we discover a person with a successful history of using alcohol suddenly plunging into overt alcoholism when one of these life crises arise. Alcohol becomes the palliative of grief, and the alcoholic is deprived of what our first psychologist called the grief work. A second and just as important consideration in understanding alcoholics is to know that they feel a great deal of grief when we ask them to give up alcohol. Alcohol is, in all truth, a loved one. It has substituted for many things in the alcoholic's life. It has replaced relationships with people, dealing with reality, and has filled in the gaps of spiritual aloneness. When alcoholics give up alcohol, they experience a great loss. If we would help them deal with the loss, we must lead them through the experience, as we would anyone else who has experienced a great loss. We encourage them to talk about it. We accept the dimensions and reality of this loss. We let them put any value they wish on this loss. Once they have been able to experience the healing of grief, we show them that life can go on. We offer them new relationships for old. We show them new ways to live. We give them new loves for the old. Once again, we are led to the conclusion that alcoholics aren't much different than anyone else, that their loss, their grief, and their recovery are not much different from ours. I never got anybody drunk. I'm not surprised when a counselor of alcoholics lays on me the information that he or she is carrying a terrible crushing burden, that it is only because of extraordinary powers endowed by some powerful source that they are able to escape the horrendous fate known as counselor burnout. One of my associates dealt with that matter perfectly. I never got anybody drunk, he said, and I never got anybody sober. I suppose that if one is going to take the credit for the ones who get well, one should also be willing to accept the blame for the ones who stay sick. This seems somehow a messy way of handling it and attributes to alcoholism professionals considerably more power than they have. It is obvious to all of us that more alcoholics get well when there are competent, caring people available, but we are dealing with a tremendously complicated disease. About the best a doctor can do with a sick person is to make it possible for the person to heal him or herself. If we are very, very good, or very, very lucky, or both, we might fulfill the same function. We must care about our clients and care about them to the extent that we hurt when they hurt. It is only by letting them know that this virtual stranger with no axe to grind and really loves them, that we achieve the rapport necessary to begin recovery. The counselor gets tired, sad, and inattentive simply because the counselor is human. Counselors need vacations and changes of scenery just as everyone else does. I guess until I get somebody drunk, I won't take credit for anyone who gets sober. Then I don't have to carry such a tremendous burden, and I can get on with my business. Stand still and hurt. Sometimes there isn't anything to do but stand still and hurt. The person who was speaking was just your standard alcoholic with no credentials, except a desire to stop drinking, but the wisdom of his statement impressed me. For years I've been running away from pain, aspirin and booze for physical pain, tranquilizers and booze for mental pain, and simply disappearing when there was a social situation that might arise which would cause any kind of pain. When I finally got the message from AA, I decided that pain was simply part of living and that I couldn't escape it by running. When it caught up with me, it was even worse, so I ran faster and faster. I finally decided that there was nothing to do sometimes but stand still and hurt. A careful study of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous reveals that this well sums up what the alcoholic is asked to do. The part of the serenity prayer which says, "Accept the things I cannot change," is talking about it. Searching out and redressing old wrongs is purely painful. A personal inventory is always distressing. I am sure there is such a thing as intractable pain, both physical and psychic, just as there are excellent programs for teaching the sufferer to live with intractable psychic pain. It's called Alcoholics Anonymous. The first step in learning to live with intractable pain is to stop running, and when we must, stand still and hurt. Shut up and listen. For many years, I have had this slogan taped to my desk where no one can see it but me. There are those who would say I don't pay much attention to it, but I do nonetheless. We don't need to be alcoholic to have a need for someone to listen to us. The listener doesn't have to have any special qualities other than the willingness to learn. From time to time, everyone needs someone who will listen. I'm sure that the highly trained psychologists and psychologists can listen to what we have to say, and before long, they know more about us than we know about ourselves. This is not the kind of listening I am talking about. The kind I'm talking about says that what the speaker has to say is important, therefore the speaker is important. The listener is not engaged in non-directive therapy, but the results are often therapeutic. To express their thoughts, speakers must put them in order and often will gain insight from the process. Many times advice is worth just what you pay for it. Since my advice is free, I don't offer it. Good listeners don't try to give advice. They don't try to lead the speaker with perceptive questions, nor do they sit in judgment. They don't offer solutions. They just listen. An excellent example of this kind of listening takes place at an AA meeting. The speakers have not one, but maybe as many as 30 or 40 listeners, all attentive. They thought they would never be able to speak in public, but here they are up front. When they sit down, they feel good because others have listened. Listening is a skill that can be developed, and good listeners can always find someone who needs them. Pray for them. Once upon a time, an alcoholic presented me with one of the toughest challenges I have ever had. I had just finished complaining at considerable length about an alcoholic woman whom I had helped to sobriety. He not only didn't show any gratitude for the gift which I had bestowed upon him, but he was going out of his way to give me a hard time. I probably could have handled indifference, but to actively oppose me was going too far. Pray for him. What do you mean pray for him? Pray for his well-being, his health, or whatever comes into your mind. If I prayed whatever came into my mind, he wouldn't be long for the world. But after considerable backing and filling, I did pray for him. It wasn't much of a prayer. It was as phony as a $3 bill. It was sort of a now I lay me down to sleep prayer. I'm sure that it didn't rattle the chandeliers in heaven. Of course nothing happened, nothing except that it was a little easier for me to pray for him the next time, and the prayer was a little less phony. I would like to say that my prayers brought this person great wealth and happiness and that they changed my entire attitude toward him. I could say that, but it wouldn't be true. What these prayers finally did, however, was to remove my resentments to the extent that I was able to establish some sort of reasonable relationship with him. I don't suppose my prayer changed this person, but it changed me. Once again, alcoholic wisdom was just that, wisdom. In all our affairs, ask alcoholics who are knowledgeable about the 12th step what it means to them, and the chances are good that they will tell you that it means to carry the message to still suffering alcoholics. Ask them about the rest of step 12 and you will likely get a blank look. The 12th step in its entirety is this. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry the message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Somehow the last part of this step is overlooked. The result is a disaster. Alcoholics will, perhaps unconsciously, compartmentalize their lives by putting their drinking and its treatment in one compartment and the rest of their lives in another. Thus, the principles of prayer and inventory and surrender apply only to matters directly concerned with drinking, leaving them free to live the rest of their lives completely unfettered. However, the problem is that the walls of these compartments have a way of leaking so that the alcoholics suddenly find themselves hip deep in the problems that used to accompany their drinking. This sort of thing gives sobriety a bad name, and since they have the same problems whether they are drinking, the logical conclusion for alcoholics is that they might as well be drinking. If you are an alcoholic or the sponsor of an alcoholic or someone who loves an alcoholic, you must be aware of the importance of the second part of the 12th step. When offered a second drink, it is an old drinking custom to say, well, a bird can't fly with one wing. The alcoholic who tries to live only the first part of the 12th step will fly like a bird with one wing.